Welcome to Transformation Universe,
the Real Talk podcast
with Christina Bösenberg
and Daniel Breitwieser. Two innovators from two generations talking with today's most forward-thinking leaders from business, politics, and society about their views on our world and on the future.
Our guests share their approach to change, which hacks lead to innovation, and what they've learned from their biggest fuck-ups. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Transformation Universe with me and my dear co-host, Christina. Today, we have a fantastic guest tuning in from Amsterdam, Otti Vogt. Welcome to the show and thanks for making the time today and this evening.
Thank you very much for having me, Daniel and Christina. It's a pleasure.
Right.
Cool. Christina, do you want to get started with our first question, or was it me? What did we agree on?
It was you.
I think it was me. All right, cool. I'll shoot. Actually, the first question, Otti, which we asked to every guest, and looking at your Vita and all the amazing content you put out, we're especially excited to ask you about the learnings you took from your biggest fuck-ups or fuck-up. You can choose. What were they and what have you learned from it that has impacted your life?
That's a very intriguing question, Daniel. I think three thoughts come up for me. Firstly, I would say probably the most critical failure is not to understand that failures are indeed opportunities for learning. I think Nelson Mandela once said, "I never lose. I either succeed or I learn." And I think maybe for a long time during my career, I've probably been guilty and really tried to avoid failure. And only during the last few years, I've allowed myself to experiment much more. And secondly, I think if I look back at my history, I think one of the things that is still ruminating in my mind is that I really wanted to become an entrepreneur. I started my career in a startup company and I loved it. And my plan was to become an internet entrepreneur after university. So in 2001-2, we had a number of beautiful business plans and we were trying to find funding to start in earnest. But if you recall, at that time, the internet bubble burst and it was extremely difficult to get funding for innovative ideas. Actually, it was quite difficult for a young startup to be funded in Italy, even at the best of times. But in those years, it proved impossible. So after 12 months or so, we gave up and my friends went to do their MBAs and I went into consulting. So if I think about one big thing that is still very much in my mind, it's probably that desire to work on a new venture. However, I must admit, I've learned since then that you can become an entrepreneur, or as they say, an intrapreneur, also in a big organization. I think Tendaji Viki talks about this in his interesting new books about pirates in the Navy, how innovators lead transformation. And I think that's a little bit what I've tried to do thereafter. And finally, going back to that notion of learning from failures, it is probably not the big things that I've learned from most, but many, many small things that have somehow happened during my career. From incorrectly planning the scope or duration or the technical complexity of big projects, or not always dealing in the best possible way with difficult moments or with difficult people. We have, I think, lots of assumptions in our minds and lots of habitual patterns that it sometimes takes a long time until we allow ourselves to take time to reflect and go under the surface to really see the blind spots and learn from those recurring small mistakes.
Absolutely. And it's always two sides of one coin. Whenever you are winning, somebody else is losing. And whenever you are failing, probably somebody else is winning. Actually, in the end, it's a holistic picture. Right, right. Thanks for sharing that. I'm intrigued to ask you what made you change your attitude towards failing?
That's another great question. I have to say, I cannot recall a specific moment when that happened. I reckon it is somehow a non-linear process of personal development where over time we become more conscious. And which really, I think, brings us to the very core of the question, how do we learn to learn faster? Or as we often say in Agile, how can we become best at getting better? And I believe quite strongly that there is a relationship between our ability to learn and our desire for control and to have power. And when we're young in our careers and lives, we often don't allow ourselves to fail because we fear to look bad. There's a deep desire in human beings for that sense of belonging and love. We want to be appreciated and look as if we are right in succeeding. And because we feel the need to remain in control, we very often desperately try to uphold our own egos using power to dominate over a situation or to dominate over others, rather than listening and learning. And letting that desire for control go, I think, is very, very important. And at the same time, it's very difficult. What brought us here won't bring us there. We have to become comfortable with being vulnerable, allowing ourselves to be asking for help and admitting that we're not perfect, putting the love for growth and learning above our fear of losing power. And once we allow ourselves to become vulnerable, we suddenly realize that the quality of our relationships, the quality of the questions becomes a lot stronger, and we gain in credibility and trust. And it's not only about the relationship with others, but also with ourselves and with our deeper purpose, who we are. True growth, I believe, is always dialogic. It is dependent on our ability to create and hold a safe space for individual and collective reflection, and for those questions, which are often more important than the answers. And I guess learning to not to take ourselves too seriously is probably part of that too. And for me personally, this was and continues to be not an easy journey. I went through a number of phases when I tried to be an expert and control everything, and initially it went very well, and then phases where I did the same and things started to become too complex, and I couldn't work harder over the weekend to just fix stuff. And by applying that same attitude, it became very hard. And at some stage, I realized that there is a different way, where relationships are as important as achieving specific outcomes, where the questions are as important as the answers. And what really helped me here was becoming a system psychodynamics coach. That has been very powerful for me. And the moment you adopt a more mature and conscious stance, suddenly other people around you start to do the same. And synchronously, the world starts to change. It's very pervasive. Yet, I also think it is very difficult to teach this in a classroom or learn it from a book. I think you really have to live through these different stages and allow yourselves to experiment. It takes a long time to understand deeply that actually your behavior is often achieving the opposite of what you really desire. And someone suggested that you cannot think yourself into a new way of acting. You have to act yourself into a new way of thinking. And that's, I think, a little bit that miracle of transformation.
Yeah, you almost answered my next question. So, Otti, you are the Chief Transformation Officer of ING. And after like 10 to 15 years in Agile transformations, I mean, ING is the example, the most popular example of Agile transformations. And I'm really curious to hear your point of view on how did that go? What were the biggest blocking points? Is it at a status now where you say, oh, cool, that's great. We are going well. We are doing good. So what is the status quo, and what were the biggest blocking points?
What is the status, and what were the biggest blocking points? So let me firstly maybe provide a bit of context for our journey of Agile transformation. Because when I joined ING about 5 years ago, ING had already successfully rolled out Agile in the Netherlands and very much in the IT domain. And since I joined, we've taken it to all the countries ING is operating in and to other domains beyond IT, like sales and service and support. Moreover, we have started to unite our country operations into a cross-country banking platform, which poses new challenges in terms of meta-organizational design and the overall operating model. And as a result, we really started to move towards a learning organization at scale. And this is a very, very intriguing journey. Agile at its core is a product management methodology, enabling more effective and faster new product development. However, it was never meant to be just a method, but rather a management philosophy and a mindset to create the context and environment for organizational learning. As BCG said last year, the companies that will survive in the 2020s are those able to compete on learning. And that is really what the yardstick is, which we adopt to measure ourselves. So in that context, in terms of status, I would say the rollout from a methodological perspective has gone extremely, extremely well. We are seeing the benefits in terms of velocity and employee engagement and customer satisfaction. Yet in terms of getting to that next phase, what I often call beyond Agile, that true learning organization at scale, that is a very different challenge. In particular, I think in that context, it becomes very important to acknowledge there are different lenses to interpret an organizational system. Our traditional lens is a behaviorist lens where we see organizations as machines to be optimized. Typically, with that lens in mind, we design organizations where there are a number of allegedly very clever people who have power and information, and they use these to control others and drive top-down change in order to continuously improve that machine. And with this mindset, we typically set up continuous improvement and lean initiatives. We plan incentives to manage human resources, a bit like carrots and sticks, and we craft high-performance cultures, etc. And I guess to a degree, it is possible to roll Agile as a methodology with that mindset to a certain extent, but I believe it won't go very far. And more, I'm personally convinced that this behaviorist type of paradigm is limited in regards to our next stage of evolution towards enterprise agility and learning at scale. Therefore, I'm very much turning towards a paradigm which interprets organizations ontologically, so to speak, as a living being. And this is critically different in at least three aspects. Firstly, it comprehends an organization as a complex adaptive system where deterministic relationships are not prevalent. In a complex system, we cannot fully control and move from A to B and B to C. We can only continually move from A towards A+. Hence, we cannot predict the future or kind of drive change top-down in a deterministic way. In such a world, we need to decentralize power and information to enable self-organization and establish structures for kind of what we call generative dialogue in order to enable continual adaptation and experimentation and collective learning and emergence everywhere. And secondly, I believe in so-called deliberately developmental organizations, i.e. organizations that are truly human-centric and seek to create an environment where people flourish individually and in community and can bring their whole self to work. Work in this context has to be meaningful, and organizations can only be truly successful if their members prosper and if true collaboration and co-elevation occurs between people. And I think the first and the second point are very connected. And finally, and a bit similarly, I believe as businesses we have a responsibility to redefine our purpose. We have an accountability to step up and look after all our stakeholders and our planet. We need to redesign our organizations in a humanistic and ecocentric way and create kind of the regenerative and mutually beneficial links with everything that the organization touches. Sustainability cannot be just an afterthought. So when adopting this new metaphor, there still certainly is a lot for us to do, but it offers a lot of very exciting new perspective. And whilst, of course, there are no simple answers or templates, I clearly experience how my own role is changing. I work much more like an organizational acupuncturist, or as some say, an ecologist. And the premise of a living organization is that people naturally develop, and if they don't, then probably something is wrong with the context, with the system. So I and kind of other leaders have to become much more able to decipher the dynamics of teams and systems. What are the energy flows in that living body of the organization, and how can energy be unstuck? And a lot of my work is to create the kind of contextual conditions for that natural emergence to really occur. And speaking more holistically, it also means that as leaders, we have an opportunity, and I think also a responsibility, to create organizations and a world where people flourish, and where by the same token, we create results.
Is that what you mean with humanocracy when you were talking, I heard you talk about humanocracy. So is that what you mean by that? Or how is that looking like in real life, in your normal organizational life? So can we get it a bit more tangible from you?
Very good question. Yes, that is very much how I see humanocracy in terms of a paradigm. Of course, I cannot possibly speak for Gary Hamel, who I think very famously came up with the term and who correlates some very specific interventions with the notion of humanocracy. And I have some doubts, for example, in terms of meritocracy, which Gary posits as one of its enablers. But trying to be a bit more tangible in terms of interventions, I always look at structures, at processes, and at culture. And in terms of structure, I think we see a lot of organizational development beyond Agile, which doesn't prescribe a specific structure by itself, towards, for example, sociocracy, ambidextrous organizations, portfolios, and mesh networks, and models like hires with internal markets and micro-enterprises. Structures are becoming a lot more modular and fluid and self-organized. And in terms of processes, the focus is on creating mechanisms for collective learning and adaptation, putting people into a position where they truly enter the dialogue about strategy and its continual adaptation. And this includes, for example, agile rituals and retrospectives, but also Bayer rooms and marketplaces, consent-based decision-making, and so on. And it also means we need to look at support processes like budgeting and performance management. I'm a big believer that transformation is not about big bang restructuring, but because that means you have already missed the adaptation which should naturally occur. If you create a big transformation program, it probably means there is a gap between where you are and where you would desire to be, which is so big that you need to do something dramatic. And finally, in terms of culture, we need to enable that psychological safety and establish an environment where people are able and willing to collaborate with their whole selves, so to speak, and where they can be happy at work. And this is where I think things like signature practices to foster kinship and community building and ethical dialogue, coaching, etc. become very valuable. And I think in the DDOs, deliberately developmental organizations I quoted earlier, there's also a huge attention on community and bringing people truly together. However, I really think more than structures, it is about going back to core principles. As Gary always says, in humanocracies, the business of business is people. And maybe it's also important to consider that every organization is different. Manfred Kitz de Vries once suggested that every baby has their mother and every leader has their context, and the same is true for an organizational system. We cannot just copy and paste best practices, as every organization is unique. Hence, more than answers, it is critical to enable an environment where people can ask the right questions and collectively experiment and evolve.
How do you, so beautiful words, and I think it could have listened to this for a longer time, but I have one question that pops up, and I also now understand the hobby poet description that you put on your LinkedIn. And you are truly a visionary, and I think you've also been part of a lot of transformations, and you are transforming organizations as an intrapreneur, as you say. But how do you actually make this tangible? Everything you just mentioned about the developmental organizational piece and empowering the individual and also achieving individual transformation. How do you make it tangible, especially to leaders, right? Like, how does the role of a leader differ to what it has been maybe over the last decades, where we know that top down has been the most prominent approach and still is in many organizations? I mean, we're all German, we know that. What does that imply for leadership, and how do you concretely do that maybe in your organization at ING and to change that paradigm of leadership towards a more human-centered organization?
That's another great question, Daniel, and indeed very important. And as you know, you can hear me talking about leadership all the time. I'm convinced that the maturity of an organization can never truly exceed the maturity of its leadership. Someone has called this the leadership lid. And I really believe that in a learning organizations, leaders must take on a different role, because otherwise it cannot work. And this role is not so much to tell people what to do, but to lead through context and hold that environment for others to flourish. And as we said at the beginning, that very often means that we have to let go and start to truly serve the organization and its purpose. And if I had to call out some kind of specific implications, I would probably focus on three things. Firstly, self-awareness and mindfulness. Leaders create culture with everything they say and with every move they make. And we know from research that in an organizational system, people very often model their behaviors and to a very large extent on their respective superiors. And this gives leaders great influence, but also important responsibilities to be highly mindful of how they show up and who they are. And especially in times like these, where there's significant uncertainty and ambiguity. So reflective practices and meditation and emotional intelligence, I think, become very, very important. And secondly, this notion of system thinking and organizational development. I think that is something which is not traditionally schooled, so to speak, and trained in our organizations. And this is really important. Leaders need to acquire the ability to sense and make sense of the organizational context, the energy flows that make up that organization, and to understand that there's always anxiety that is always present in individuals and teams, and see what is going on under that proverbial iceberg. when I talked about that machine paradigm earlier, that lens is very much limited to everything that is visible, structures and behaviors and processes. It's to a degree, it's an engineering paradigm. We have very clear rules on how we can improve things. And then a living being type of metaphor, we go below the iceberg and we suddenly start to see, oh, actually, there are people and their relationships. And it's about nurturing those relationships and the connection and growth between individuals, and to change the context in such a way that the anxieties that are there are being dealt with in an effective way, so that collective learning and purpose emerges. Because I've seen from experience that if these anxieties are not being dealt with, then they very often materialize in places that are not conducive to fostering the system's success. And thirdly, I believe leaders need very strong listening and coaching skills to help individuals and teams reflect and nurture that organizational trust. And this also covers a basic understanding, I think, of psychology and psychodynamics and facilitation skills, and maybe techniques like nonviolent communication, art of hosting, appreciated inquiry, etc., etc. So one thing that for me stands out is that leadership in a kind of liberated, agile organization really becomes more difficult. It's a lot easier to just rule by command and control. Hence, acquiring these capabilities is where I think really leadership development has to go. But again, it is not simply about developing skills, but it's also about developing consciousness and moral agency, especially in these times with a lot of uncertainty. We need to be able to count on people who can make decisions that are ethical and right. Responsible leaders, I would suggest, need to become very clear on who they are and why they're here. What do they stand for? What is that unique opportunity that we all have been given to make a difference? And that so almost spiritual clarity allows leaders to become those true servants of something bigger than themselves, and to lead, as John Knight writes, beyond the ego. And that is, I think, also how we ensure that we're not creating organizations which are disconnected from the world around them, from the ecology, from the ecosystem, and that are providing true value into an interconnected whole, respecting nature, respecting cosmos. But of course, such vertical leadership development is far from simple, and it seldom happens by itself and in isolation. And in my experience, one important catalyst for the development of greater consciousness in leaders and their learning about themselves is to establish peer communities of learning, where peers commit to each other's development. And this is what Keith Ferrazzi calls co-elevation. So in our organization, we've been trying to create a safe space for people to reflect and help each other reflect on how they see the world and how they can deal with difficult personal or leadership challenges. And I have to say, it's really beautiful to see some of those results.
I like that concept of co-elevation by Keith Ferrazzi as well. So how are you bringing it to life in your organization? Is it already up full blown, or is it, how is it lived? How is it working in your daily business?
Thanks, Christina. Firstly, I very much recommend Keith's book, as he offers some, I think, very useful and practical advice on leadership without authority more in general. In terms of co-elevation, in my team, we're certainly experimenting, and there are three specific aspects. Firstly, I would say we're going to great length in trying to establish a safe environment and a global community based on trust, where people are happy to speak up. And again, we owe a lot to Amy Edmondson for having emphasized psychological safety so much, especially in these days. Secondly, we are heavily investing in increasing the coaching skills of leaders and managers and also our agile coaches, providing both knowledge and more opportunities to practice. And thirdly, we've established a structured process with peer and group coaching to foster self and team reflection. And we know from many studies that adults often learn a lot more from similar peers than from external coaches or formal trainings. And we really try to bring people into a situation where they can help each other reflect, and as we say in psychodynamics, to be on that balcony and self-observe. Because I think that is very, very important as a capability. The other skill we focus on, and I mentioned it earlier, is listening, deep listening, which probably is the most underrated capability in an organization. That ability to just truly listen with an open mind, open heart, and open will, as we say in Theory U. And as Otto Scharmer suggests, listening is really the basis for generative dialogue. And of course, we are moving in an agile fashion with a self-managed supervisory group of coaches who continually adapt our experiments. But going back a little bit to the notion of organizational acupuncturist, I think co-elevation brings up a wider question of how to manage performance and development in an organization. What is our epistemology of learning, so to say? And traditionally, a performance management system consists of target setting, feedback mechanisms, and a final appraisal, which is very often linked to personal development, career development, and pay. And we very often, in terms of target setting, simplistically cascade lots of individual targets and KPIs based on some magic annual or even longer budgeting process at the beginning of the year, then have those famous uncomfortable conversations about this during the year, especially if we are behind on targets. And at the end of the year, we spend weeks and weeks to somehow generate ratings and rankings. And we hope that by doing all of this, our people and organization will learn and improve. And I'm sorry, but here's the bad news. There's a vast literature out there telling us very clearly that traditional performance management simply does not work. Full stop. In kind of none of these pieces. And leaving behind that mechanistic paradigm, I believe, rather than trying to drive others with carrots and sticks, we need to enable an environment that sparks energy and aliveness and enables human flourishing. And I believe that we need to start this whole process with something that resembles much more a process of coaching and facilitated reflections, where we not only contract team ambitions and learning objectives, but also core values and ways to engage with each other, and then help each other grow based on strength and purpose. And I've seen very powerful things happening when people actually are in that safe space to help each other, to make a commitment to each other, to co-elevate, like we said earlier.
Absolutely. And I think we'll get to talk about the power of coaching in a bit, but listening to you, I hear amazing concepts. I mean, empowerment, trust, psychological safety, and it's all beautiful things. However, the reality in many organizations is unfortunately quite different. I think you've mentioned the tremendous cost of trillions, which are due to disengagement over the last years. And what I'm just reflecting when I hear you talk, and I also have a quote from you, which is wonder and love have their place, such as science and efficiency in organizations, and also the concepts of this reflection and vulnerability and moving away from the strict context of performance reviews and facilitated reflections. How do you make that thought actually an intrinsic motivation, especially of the top of the C-level? Because it needs to top down. There need to be also some sort of role modeling in order for the rest of the organization to actually embrace these values. How have you seen that work out, and what are the difficult things also in having especially top management truly not only put those words on paper, but actually living them?
I think you're absolutely right in asking that question, even if, again, I'm frowning a little bit, because role modeling and somehow externally incentivizing others to behave in one presumably best way, ideally ours, again, could very quickly point to a paradigm that I think we should try to leave behind us. In my experience, true change always and only comes from the inside. But of course, we are starting from a situation where we often find ourselves in a very traditional and hierarchical context. And I think in that case, we need the hierarchy to change the hierarchy. And the first step here is probably to move, as Greenleaf suggests, towards that servant leadership paradigm, where senior leaders start to serve a greater collective good beyond themselves. And then in a second subsequent step, we can try to progress towards what Simon Weston calls eco-leadership, a kind of systemic and distributed capability of a system to co-create its emergent future. I think Peter Senge said something very similar in terms of leadership being that ability of an organization to create the future. And at that point, leadership is not a specific role anymore, and leaders are not endowed with positional authority as such. But now, talking about all of this with executives in today's world, I have to say I've been very surprised. Certainly in my own little world, the people I represent from an organizational standpoint are 100% invested in that desire to create human-centric organizations. But even beyond that, I sense, particularly with this pandemic, a yearning for more meaning in life and work. And very often for people, this is truly the first time in their lives when they ask themselves existential questions whilst going to the supermarket, so to speak, about the meaning of life, about why we're here, about what truly matters. And And considering all the human sacrifice and misery that comes from this pandemic, and my heart really goes out to all those people suffering from it, I believe this aspect is very significant. For those who can, I think it's a very precious and important moment to take stock of. And I've certainly personally encountered during these months a unique and strong desire of many people who are reaching out and expanding their networks to actively engage with this moment and start to experiment, asking themselves how to move from where we are towards a more meaningful place. So I think maybe the more important question, if there is a group of people who wants to join this movement, is really how we can help them. And again, you mentioned coaching, and I don't want to make publicity for one or other institution, but there are organizations out there who offer kind of solidarity or supervisory groups and hubs where professionals come together and they look at each other's challenges and learn from each other. And again, co-elevate.
Yeah, also masterminds, a lot of masterminds in the place.
There you go. And I even believe Enrique from Hacking HR, for example, is trying to create such a community. I think it's called Grow in the HR space, for leaders to come around and support each other in their endeavors. I think that is really, really beautiful, because one thing is certain: this is a unique and probably once in a lifetime opportunity for all of us to make a difference, and we cannot do it alone. And that money which we need to invest in order to even only partly heal the consequences of this crisis, we certainly cannot invest twice. So we need to get it right first time. And I feel that very strongly. And I think many others as well. But of course, I mean, I'm not closing my eyes from the fact that I also see many senior people who do not want to become part of that change. And here I would suggest, as always in business transformation, that we really must focus our efforts on those who want to come on board, or maybe those who are kind of just on the fence. We could waste our whole life on those people who are against change, but we probably would never succeed in convincing them to move, because they are probably benefiting significantly from the status quo. So the best is to mobilize those early adopters, those kind of future leaders and change agents, and co-create a movement to bring to life an alternative vision of a more sustainable future.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also then inspires society change as a whole, not only in the corporate world, but also for the whole of society, which we desperately need, actually. So coming back to transformation, and we are really interested in the intersection between the silos. So how can corporate transformation, successful corporate transformation, influence society, education, and the area of startups, or how can they influence each other better than they do today? Talking about ecosystems and agile ecosystems and the intersection between the ecosystems. Any ideas or any thoughts from your side about ecosystems firing up at the intersection points?
Actually, coming from a banking background, it would be interesting, I think.
Yeah. Here I need to take a deep breath. This is a bit like searching for the Holy Grail, of course. If you look at some of the initiatives that grew since the beginning of the pandemic, like the Gaia movement or the economy of Francesco or even Fridays for Future, I think this was really their very exam question. How do we connect different constituencies, citizens, academia, and therefore education and non-governmental organizations, governments, businesses into some sort of holistic driving force to enable change for the better? And I have to say, I really enjoyed those conversations at Davos about stakeholder capitalism, or with the likes of Kate Rayoth on the donut economy and so on, who are, I think, starting to frame a possible model for such global interconnected change. But I truly feel it's not an easy conundrum. What, again, Otto Scharmer always emphasizes is that the only way to create societal change is by bending that ray of reflection from the system back towards the individual. And it's a well-known truth in transformations that as long as the kind of we have to do something doesn't become the I will do something tomorrow, then nothing ever changes. So I guess the difficulty to enable the ecosystem change you mentioned is that every single one of us, or at least a tipping point, has to start to see that we have the opportunity to create something beautiful together if we can overcome our own individual kind of ego. But that requires a strong shift in consciousness, the ability to comprehend that everything is indeed interconnected. And it also requires the courage to self-reflect on how I can truly lead that, in inverted commas, good life, how I can serve life, and the understanding also, I think, that true happiness is always relational. And finally, it needs the discipline to become my purpose in my day-to-day life. How can I align my intention with my attention in every moment and really start to make a difference? And this is what Bill Torbert talks about when he mentions action inquiry. And here I think that in this world of social materialism that we've created, many of us are really stuck in a perennial midlife crisis. I think many of us suffer from that feeling that I'm not capable, that I'm too small, and the belief that I'm not important enough to actually have the right and the ability to cause change in this world. And my message here is simply that that's not true. My message is that the moment that you change your stance in the system synchronously, suddenly the world around you starts to change as well, because we create reality by the way that we look at the world. And the moment that we change the way we look at things, the world has already changed as well. And that's, I think, what every person who has gone through some individual transformation will confirm. So I want to give people a little bit of courage to say, if you feel there's a role for us in this world to make things better, get started. And this is where I go back to Gary Hamel, who beautifully in Humanocracy says that each and every one of us can spark experimentation and innovation from wherever we sit in an organization. We can go horizontally within our mandate, and we can grab all those people who can and want to become part of our mission and try to do small things. And if they work, then we expand and get other people who will start to come behind us. We shouldn't be too afraid to fail. And going back to what Daniel, your question was at the beginning, as Mandela said, I never fail, I either succeed or I learn. And maybe we should all have a little faith that our lives are immensely valuable, and that we're here for a reason, if that makes sense. So maybe not a strong answer on ecosystems as such, but I think it all starts with ourselves and how we individually drive the change that we want to see.
Very, very well said, and I couldn't agree more with the aspect that you also mentioned. We can spark experimentation from wherever we sit. Individuals can change something, but there is a big emphasis and focus on organizations, on large organizations, and especially the economy. Me and Christina, we were talking actually last week with the founder of Einhorn, who is now Waldemar Zeiler, who is now writing a book called Unfuck the Economy, which hopefully by that time that we are launching the podcast is already out. Highly recommended. Who are working a lot on the idea that we have to change something fundamentally about the way we do business, and especially large organizations treat not only their people but also society as a whole. I think now, a couple of days ago, we had the long life stock exchange, this new concept coming out, which is, I think, a great idea that rewards companies that actually work in alignment with society and sustainable impact. What is your take on that, especially working for a large bank, a multinational? How can multinationals actually impact our society positively, and what needs to change fundamentally in order for that to happen?
That again is a very, very big and ambitious question. And I couldn't possibly pretend that I have answers. As I sometimes say, when I was young, I had all the answers. Now I'm older and I've got all the questions. But I do suggest two things. One of my presidents once told me that transformation is simply the combination of focus and momentum. So in terms of focus, I really believe we need to start standing up for what we believe in as society and also as businesses. We cannot avoid that moral agency to say, actually, there is a difference between what's right and what is wrong. We cannot always hide behind the market, where we all know that the market is failing in certain aspects, and we have to remediate as a society by saying, this is what we want the society of our future to look like, and then work towards that. Humanity always expresses its morality through its actions. And in the current capitalistic and liberal system we're in, I believe financial institutions certainly have an important role to play. For example, we clearly need to ensure that resource allocation in financial markets also reflects the full ecological implications of our investments. And here what ING and others are doing with the Terra approach, starting to look at the ecological footprint of our investments and trying to maintain the Paris Accord in terms of limiting global warming to that 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, goes absolutely into the right direction. And I think we also need to look at kind of our institutions and the institutional framework. I recently had the pleasure to be part of a conversation with Malcolm Turnbull, the ex-PM of Australia, and Mark Carney, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, who were both advocating that we need to improve corporate disclosure across the board so that we can appreciate economic impact more holistically to enable that kind of green energy revolution. Or we even need to tax it, as Rod Schwartz recently suggested. And above all, I certainly believe as a society, we need to look at how we define success. Our society today is very focused on a materialistic success definition. And as long as what we aim for is only GDP and profit before tax, we are missing out, because price simply isn't the same as value. And we need to learn that as a society. We need to make sure that we value human beings more than wealth, and collaboration more than competition. And here I fully endorse also what Paul Pullman and others are doing in terms of supporting the SDGs. Our future will depend on kind of what gods we pray to. And frankly, the god of Mammon is a very bad start. However, we need to be aware that what is true for society as a whole is also true for kind of every organizational subsystem. It is critical that we take a step back to focus on and recognize who we are and why we're there. In an evolutionary system, what holds everything together is that source of core beliefs and values and principles that we are embodying. If these are agreed and lived, then processes and systems and policies and structures become almost secondary. But also the reverse is true. We can do everything we want in terms of kind of more agile or kind of evolved structures and policies. If people don't have kind of sustainable and common beliefs and values that under the iceberg or below the iceberg aspect that I mentioned, we will fail to realize that collective emergent purpose. So that's in terms of focus. And secondly, if we look at momentum, I believe we are certainly struggling. Time to refocus is running out fast. And here again, from an agile perspective, I would say, let's not try to solve the complete puzzle. Let's enable and connect people and give them the autonomy, and then just walk and adjust. So I reckon the question really is, how can we rally enough people around a belief set that unites us towards that more sustainable future? How can we create a collaborative movement of change within and across organizations? And I guess we need some sort of unifying vision, and we need some kind of self-sustained process of collaborative action. In terms of vision, I believe truly the SDGs are a great starting point, yet they're also very cognitive. And I think we need to do more work on that collective narrative. As Buckminster Fuller once said, you never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, we must build a compelling new model that makes the old model obsolete. And that new model needs to have pull energy. It needs to be something compelling that people really want to come on board with. And in terms of collaboration, unfortunately, kind of generally speaking, we are much better in competing than collaborating. And I'm sometimes worried that even in the debates that we're having, everybody has a different book, a framework, a concept, and it quickly gets very cognitive and very divisive. And hence, in terms of creating that momentum, I sometimes feel we might need to focus much more on the emotional, kind of cherishing that visceral feeling of belonging and love that we can thrive together. Creating momentum is kind of how we unite people who have different viewpoints and worldviews and ambitions. And again, I really think we need to start with ourselves to allow that to happen. So I don't have a simple answer, Daniel, unfortunately. I truly wish I had.
Some good pointers. I just expected some good pointers. I think that's what we received.
Which we got.
Absolutely.
I certainly believe that people like myself need to start thinking about it and start coming behind the initiatives that are there, like the SDGs.
So talking about Otti again, what helped you personally in your transformational leadership journey? What was it? How did you approach that?
How did I approach my own transformation? I've pondered about this quite a bit, and it's not easy. I mean, one thing that is certain is that vertical development, as we call it, is truly a lifelong process. As we say, vitae non scholae discimos. It's a kind of life, not school, that really educates us. And I think it's iterative and experiential in terms of learning, and often implies some suffering, because kind of we really have to allow ourselves to fail sometimes in trying to push things towards the different perspectives in order to appreciate that there are different perspectives, which requires a degree of humbleness and a positive stance to reflection and learning. And I also think, frankly, that age plays a role, where my 20 years younger self would probably not think much of what I'm suggesting here today. But when we look at research to understand how people transition from one kind of mindset or paradigm into another, what in coaching we sometimes call the famous shift in the room, we see that normally three things are required. Firstly, a cognitive access, the learning that an alternative exists. I'm seeing a door that before was not there. And for me, this cognitive access quite often came from reading lots of books, about leadership or psychology or sociology or business books, or from talking to people who sometimes had a very different perspective. The second aspect is emotional. And sometimes this is also called the escalation of discontent. You often must first come to a point in your life where the old ways of behavior and thinking are really not producing the results that you're hoping for, or the results are no longer meaningful for you anymore. And then the final element is the will and the commitment to listen and change. And that's what we often see in so-called servant leadership, that you're truly starting to commit to becoming servant to something greater than yourself, and in a transpersonal sense. And I think you need to tap into that calling like an energy field. I've always in my life tried to become a good leader of myself and of others. And one thing I've learned is that more than writing beautiful poetry and purpose statements, so to speak, commitment has to come from somewhere deeper. It has to be something that you're willing to stand up for and suffer for, and then to make that commitment to. So I think cognitive access and an emotional escalation point, and then that true commitment to say, I'm here for a reason. And whilst how people develop, I believe, is quite different for every person, there are some similarities, but it also is quite difficult to give advice. But I always suggest it always starts with being open to it and going on that journey, continuously trying to be mindful of yourself and what is going on in you and in your relationships, and to explore that purpose. Sometimes it's a quite terrifying journey, but it's also a very liberating journey. And I believe for many of us, there's really a lot that we can do in order to become better leaders. And something else is very true, which is you can only lead others to where you have been yourself. So it's worthwhile going on to that journey.
You mentioned great things here. I mean, of course, the failing, the growing up, the acquiring knowledge, and finding your purpose, and finding a lot about, out about yourself. And you mentioned coaching. Do you believe everyone should have a coach or have been coached once in their lifetime? What's your opinion on that?
Most certainly, yes. And not only, I actually believe leaders should be trained in coaching. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, I think coaching is very useful because it's sometimes very difficult to see those blind spots in the famous Johari window by ourselves. We are conditioned through our lives to perceive reality in a certain way because we through our family relationships and then through the groups or the society we grow into, we learn to see certain things and not to see other things. And very often, deeper self-reflection requires that critical friend at your side who is there as that little nagging voice to say, how can you be sure of that? What is the energy behind your words and thoughts and actions? What is your stance and why? Are you fully honest with yourself? Is there not a little bit of something else that you might want to go into, or at least explore your feelings towards to understand what is actually happening underneath the behavior, underneath that thought? Or in groups, what is being said, what is not being said, who is listened to and why. And I think this goes back to that co-elevation we mentioned earlier, which is at its heart is really facilitated reflections and shared learning. Yalom talks about consensual validation. Now, you don't necessarily need a coach for all that, but I think you can you need someone who is that critical person, who cares about you and is honest with you. But they must not fall into that advice trap. coaching is not about giving advice or solving the problem, but about helping people to go deeper into the understanding of themselves and the issues in their relationship with themselves and with the people around them and with meaning, so that they can kind of tap into the answers which are in themselves. And here I believe it is very useful for leaders indeed to have some coaching training. And kind of as always, you learn a lot when you teach. And the ability to self-reflect is critical to self-lead, but also to lead others. And this is exactly what Bill Torbert describes in his kind of momentous work on the balance of power, that capability that mature adults can develop to continuously inquire, kind of how do I feel where I am in terms of my self-awareness, how am I positioned against the people around me, the relationships I have, and how am I positioned towards my intentionality? Am I living my purpose? Am I becoming my purpose? And am I doing what I feel is allowing life sort of kind of speak to through me to become that servant leader? And that is a capability that requires a lot of discipline and a lot of practicing. But coaching, I think, offers the first access to that. It certainly kind of was very, very important for me.
You mentioned purpose, and I think Christina and I, we really like talking about that. That question, what's Otti's definition of purpose, of individual purpose? I'm not talking about organizational purpose here for now.
I thought about this a little bit when my friends in the HR domain started to kind of help people to find their own purpose through various development programs. And kind of I've got two reflections. Firstly, in terms of how to define purpose, I often observe people who were focusing on kind of what their declared values were, or what some of their past experiences were, which they particularly cherished, or what they felt their role was to be. And then they try to somehow phrase it as kind of beautiful prose or a purpose statement to share with others. And for me, this never quite worked. In my mind, purpose has to go deeper. It sits somehow behind all those cognitive layers, and it's much more about who you are, kind of what your needs are and what you stand for than what you do. As Fred Laloux once said, you cannot inhabit the we if you don't fully inhabit the I. And I think the purpose is a little bit about that we. And secondly, I think purpose is what really helps you to take you out of yourself in terms of that adult development journey. Many people get very good at being mindful or self-aware, doing meditation, but they are still often unable to engage that rite of passage to move from knowing yourself towards becoming yourself, and going towards that transpersonal servant mindset. Hence, purpose, I think, must create that energy and that new identity, that transpersonal calling, which you're willing to commit to. It kind of what pulls you out of yourself from being self-centric to becoming other-centric or ecocentric. And for me, kind of, if you ask me what my purpose is, I feel very strongly at the moment that my purpose is twofold. One, it is really to help people develop and flourish in kind of having greater self-reflection, having greater self-agency, and taking more accountability for their lives. And very much in that organizational context in which I operate. And on the other hand, I also feel I've got a bit of a role in just giving people hope, maybe. Hope that there's a way to come closer to yourself and make a greater contribution and find more meaning in your life. And I feel quite strongly that this is important because people are yearning for it, especially in these times. I don't know what you guys feel.
Absolutely. I 100%
Agreed.
couldn't agree more. So is that also why you are engaged in the globally responsible leadership initiative, or did you even found it? I couldn't find it in the internet. So what is that? What does it have to do with you?
Well, I really couldn't take any credit for the initiative, as it has been there a long time before I joined. But I think the GRLI, so the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative, is a wonderful initiative. It's chaired by Claire Maxwell from the Oasis School of Human Relations, and it's trying to facilitate inclusive and systemic change across how we live and make a living, how we learn and how we lead. And the GRLI mission is to catalyze the development of globally responsible leadership and practice in organizations and society across the globe. And kind of rather than a think tank, it is more of an action tank. It operates a so-called global community of responsible action in partnership with the UN Global Compact. And it seeks to foster both knowledge creation and practical experimentation in collaboration with a wide range of business schools and universities and some very smart people. And I personally came to the GRLI through John Knights, the author of Leading Beyond the Ego, whom I mentioned earlier, and with whom I had the kind of a privilege to talk quite frequently. And I have to admit, I immediately joined because it just felt like an organization exactly like the ones I believe in. It is focused on core virtues and values and kind of operates as a global, adaptive and collaborative network. And it very strongly supports the need for a new way of leading, which is ethically and morally grounded in sustainable ethics. And that integrative responsibility to the self, the others and the whole, me, we, all of us, forms the core of that initiative and inquiry underpinning the GRLI's work and kind of way of working. And it kind of embraces an entrepreneurial approach and always says kind of think big, act small, but start now. And then kind of that's really at the heart of the initiative, to start and do something.
Great. And everybody can find great YouTube clips. So if you're interested in digging deeper into that topic, please go find Otti on YouTube and listen to his conversations and talks. Unfortunately, we cannot deep dive into that, but it's worthwhile, definitely. You have a pretty busy position with a global responsibility. So how do you make sure that you are personally staying balanced, so staying happy at work? How do you do it?
Yeah, another very stimulating question that has kept me very engaged during the last few years. Now, in terms of being happy at work, there are lots of different definitions as to what that is. But simply put, kind of, I believe in an organization as a system of energy, and making that energy a joyful energy is really what I aspire to enable through what I do in my role. There's the Greater Good Center at the University of Berkeley once published research where organizational happiness kind of depends on 4 pillars called PERC: purpose, engagement, resilience, and kindness. And in my experience, that is not a bad starting point. And kind of how do I keep myself happy? It's quite similar, right? I think firstly, purpose. I spend a lot of time learning new things, reading or being in dialogue with others, and I try to proactively support the learning of others. Right? I always say when I was young, I would lie in bed in the evening and kind of go through action points and see if I had done everything that I had promised, and kind of as a result, I would see kind of how good I was in doing what I was doing. Today, when I'm in bed at night, I only try to ask myself 2 questions. One is, have I grown? Have I learned? And then have I helped others to grow and learn? I think at the beginning of my career, I sometimes made the mistake to put outcomes and results above the relationship with others. And since I've relinquished that attitude, I found a lot more purpose and meaning in my work. And secondly, in terms of the kind of engagement and kindness, for me, it's really about crafting a system that maximizes autonomy and collaboration across the organization. And today I can honestly say that I'm certainly a spark in that system, but the responsibility is totally shared and decentralized with a brilliant team of people around me. My role has moved far away from that traditional kind of leader who has all the answers and is always trying to be kind of the most clever person in the room. And kind of more and more, my role is really to be the guardian for the purpose of the system, and then this acupuncturist who is constantly vigilant to the processes that carry the life energy of the organization, like, as we said, performance management or dialogue management, conflict, and so on, trying to optimize engagement and kindness and trust and learning. And as I said earlier, there's always anxiety and tension in an organization, in the system. It's important kind of to enable a culture where people are safe and willing to speak up, where there's kind of radical candor, and where people are able to deal with conflicts. And of course, the same is true for myself. I try to be kind and engage, and that comes back to me. And with all that, I'm kind of really not the lonely leader who works all the hours of the day and the weekend. And some people say leadership is lonely, but I believe that is really a kind of wrongly understanding the concept of leadership. Actually, for me, being kind of happy at work and resilient is not that difficult today. I find a lot of time for recovery, and I've long stopped to answer emails during kind of out of office hours, bar the emergency. And I'm very happy with that, I have to say.
And it's inspiring to hear you talk, but it's also inspiring to, have engaged with you in several communities and webinars and conversations. What I really also value in you, or what it seems like, is not only looking by your LinkedIn on the MBAs and what studies, also in Italy, where my brother also studied in Bologna, but education seems to have a really big value for you. What, in your opinion, is today's role of formal education, and is it living up to the expectations that you have to them, or that we as a society should have to the formal education systems?
Oh, that's another very, very big question. In brief, my gut reaction is no. But then, of course, I've not been in formal education for a long time, so my views might very well be out of date. But three things come up. Firstly, I think there's excessive focus on formal cognitive learning. Brian Angert, the CPO of the Curian, and a friend and one of the examples for what Bob Keegan called these deliberately developmental organizations. Brian always said that there's a big difference between learning and development. Learning is about knowledge, whilst development is about letting go. And I think sometimes, if I look at myself, and I'm very academic and I love learning and I love knowing, so to speak, but sometimes I think I'm fooling myself, and we are fooling ourselves, that we will grow by simply accumulating more and more knowledge, especially in these times where knowledge is universally accessible. And often it is maybe much more important to learn to look at things not from a cognitive perspective, but to let go and sense from an intuitive, from a with your heart perspective, and look at things from different ways. And in many of the conversations we have, people come up with lots and lots of frameworks, and it almost feels like we're all afraid to actually allow ourselves to go to a more vulnerable, emotional and relational level. Earlier this year at Davos, I met a lady called Sonny Grunewald, a very successful Swiss entrepreneur. And Sonny told me that she's sponsoring a new executive MBA where she was building continual coaching and peer coaching into the schedule. And I think that is probably what we need to create a space and process where our people can reflect at a deeper level and grow together on top of that knowledge intake. And I think that's important. And secondly, I strongly believe we need much more effective lifelong learning. Someone suggested that 60% of the professions of people entering elementary school today have not yet even been invented. And with robotics and artificial intelligence, we will see significant impact the future of work. And data and technology will also bring new opportunities. So we need to be able to enable people who are starting to learn, but also people whose jobs are impacted by these changes to continuously develop. And finally, maybe I think our schools and universities need to upgrade a sometimes quite traditional, anachronistic teaching mechanism. I think we have sometimes the same challenges in organization with hierarchical systems and behaviorisms that we also see in schools. We need better systems to truly unleash the creativity and potential of our students. And I believe we need to invest more time into humanistic and moral studies. Our world is immensely complex, and we need people who can make the right choices for the common good of all of us. As Steve Jobs once quipped, robots don't have dreams. It's our job as human beings to make those moral choices as humanity. We cannot let that technology or complexity take over. And I was at a webinar recently where someone suggested that these days technology is strategy. And I was thinking, I hope not.
Absolutely, our topic, Christina. But I just, to comment on this, I think you just said 60% of the jobs we will have in a couple of years don't even exist yet. And we have to focus on development, also in education. And I would even add to that, to make the point even more clear, I think that 99% of the knowledge that's out there is already available online. So I don't think that should be the job of formal education, and maybe even closing the gap as well that you just described so beautifully. So
I'm aware of time. Yeah. Guys, so I think we need to come to an end, but I'm really curious. We have one question that I always like to pose is, if you were about to found a startup now, Otti, what would your startup be? So if you were a founder, or if you were about to found at the moment, what would you do?
Oh, what a great question. But I actually cannot even start to pretend to have an answer. As I believe in emergence and I believe in Agile, I would probably just try to make a list of those 10 people who I like and admire in terms of their ability to create new things or ways of doing things in my network. And then I would give them all a call and try to convince them to come on a kind of 2 weeks mountain hike where we could all hang out together and brainstorm. And I think kind of the challenge would probably be how we could make this world a little better with the means and the resources that we have. And I'm pretty sure something would come out.
Make sure to save 2 spots for me and Christina.
Well, so crystal ball question, Otti. We have one final question that we are asking each of our guests. So if you had a crystal ball and could predict the future, how is the future of humanity looking in 2050? How is humanity, business, education looking in 30 years from your perspective?
Wow, you've really saved the easy question for the end. So how would humanity look like in 30 years from now? Now, I've argued very strongly today that we couldn't possibly predict the future, and therefore, I would rather say we need to set out a vision to create the future. Rutger Bregman comes to mind, who has written that wonderful book, Utopia for Realists, which is really beautiful. And in his book, he quotes Oscar Wilde, who once said that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. Progress, in fact, is somehow the realization of utopias. So I would suggest let us together create that utopia that we all believe we should aim for. Let's recreate that vision, that human vision for society to go somewhere where we can all flourish together and where some of the imbalances and the terrible things happening today would be remediated. And more importantly, let us establish a more effective mechanism to work together, to collaborate across countries and cultures to achieve that vision. We've built brilliant ways to compete with each other, but we have so far failed to create a lot of the mechanisms to innovate together across sectors and countries globally and to create collective value. And I think that's what we need, because the challenges we are facing as humanity requires, above all, to work together. And then if all goes well, maybe in 30 years we have already overcome competition as the primary means of working in a society, and maybe rather than having another Davos, we would have a global summit for humanity where leaders from all around the world come together with that single aim to agree annually how we can all do better as individuals, as organizations, as nations, as a global society, to contribute to a regenerative, thriving planet which can help us all to create that beautiful utopian future that we cherish.
Great. So we have a Burning Man festival for everybody. I'm looking forward to that. I'll be there. Thank you so much, Otti. It was a pleasure to have you and to have a conversation with you.
Likewise, big pleasure, and I'm a big fan of the series, and please, both of you, all my best wishes, continue to do what you're doing. I think it's a very important dialogue, and you guys are helping, I think, many people to find some answers, or at least ask the right questions. And that is probably the most important part of it. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for your words and your contributions. And speaking of dialogue, maybe where can people follow you the best, get in touch with you if they want to maybe continue an exchange of wisdom and inspiration in a one-on-one setting?
I mean, the easiest is always LinkedIn, where we've created a very, very nice community of many, many very intelligent people and thinkers, and it's very beautiful. So I'm inviting everybody to join us. And I can only stand here and represent all those brilliant minds that I had the pleasure to encounter over the last 6 to 12 months. So please come along.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Chief Operating Officer at ING CNG, and most importantly, business philosopher, poet, and inspirational leader. So thanks so much for your input, and have a great evening, and hopefully talk to you another time soon. Thank you for listening as well. Bye-bye.
And that was it with another episode of Transformation Universe.
Thanks so much for listening, and like us, share us, leave us a comment, and you'll find us on iTunes, Deezer, and Spotify.
And on everywhere podcasts are listened to. Thanks again for tuning in, and we would love to see you at our new episode. Thanks, and have a fantastic day.
Bye.